Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's NFER Classroom webinar entitled The Impact of COVID-19 School Closures on Key Stage 1. My name is Alex Cutteridge, and I'll be joined by today's presenters Susan Rose, Tara Paxman, and Lydia Fletcher. I'd like to start by introducing today's speakers. So Susan Rose started at NFER in June 2020 as a Senior Research Manager and works on the study that we're going to talk about today. Sue is also leading the follow-up study, tracking the same children as they move forward. She has a background of nearly 20 years in secondary education as a maths teacher and senior leader. Tara Paxman joined NFER in 2019 and works as a research manager. Prior to this, Tara worked as a teacher in primary schools and in early years settings. Tara works across a number of different projects covering everything from analysing qualitative research to developing innovative questions to assess children's learnings and misconceptions, using the practical knowledge gained from teaching Key Stage 1 and reception. And finally, Lydia Fletcher has been with NFER since July 2019 and works as a researcher in UK policy and practice. Before NFER, Lydia completed an undergraduate and master's degree in psychology. At NFER, Lydia works on projects relating to non-cognitive skills and well-being, such as one that investigated the link between extracurricular activities and adolescent well-being. We'll have some time at the end of the webinar for questions. I think that's enough from me, so I'll pass you over to our presenters now, who will be taking you through today's webinar.
We carried the study out with 168 state-funded schools across the whole of England, which involved over 10,000 children. It aimed to examine the impact of the disruption to learning caused by the pandemic and the subsequent school closures on the very youngest children who were at the start of their educational journey. The youngest had not completed their first year of schooling before the start of the first closures in March 2020, and this meant they would have missed out on learning school routines and expectations, as well as their first year of formal education, where many of the foundations of future learning are laid. There was also the suggestion that in households that included older siblings, these youngest of children may be less of a priority for access to IT and would require higher levels of parental support, as their age may make them less able to cope with independent learning. So in this webinar, we're going to give you an overview of the study and the key headlines from our findings in terms of attainment. And we're then going to take you through two other important aspects of the study, which are the diagnostic findings and the contextual work that we carried out. So here you can see an overview of the events and lockdowns that impacted schools since the start of the pandemic. All schools in England closed to pupils in March 2020, and only the most vulnerable and children of key workers were allowed to attend. At this point, remote learning was introduced by schools. As the closures happened very quickly and the format of this remote learning was left to the schools, there was a wide variety of provision, both in terms of content, format and style. Schools provided varying combinations of live online lessons, pre-recorded lessons, physical resources and online links to suitable resources. Some schools reported struggling with IT provision at home, both in terms of access to devices and good broadband connections, and therefore they felt restricted in what they were able to offer. A number of concerns were raised about whether remote learning would have a disproportionate impact on pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds due to a digital divide, and also differing levels of pupil and parental engagement. There was a partial reopening for a limited number of children in June 2020, and of those that are relative to our study, Year 2 pupils were eligible to return at this point, but our school survey showed that many did not. Most year groups and pupils remained at home until the start of the new school year in September 2020. There was a second set of school closures during the course of the study in January 2021, and schools did not reopen until March of that year. Even outside of these periods, many schools experienced much higher levels of absence for both staff and pupils due to COVID-19, something which is very much still continuing. So the study, which as I said earlier involved 168 schools and over 10,000 children, was a combination of quantitative research looking at pupil attainment, supplemented with qualitative evidence of school practices and teachers' perspectives on social skills and pupil well-being. It also included diagnostic analysis with the sole aim of providing useful information for teachers. So if we look at that alongside the timeline, you can see we carried out 2 assessments with Year 1 pupils in spring and summer of 2021, and 3 assessments with Year 2 pupils in autumn 2020 and spring and summer of 2021. The slide shows the timing of these assessments in relation to the lockdown periods. So you can see that Wave 1 took place in late October, early November, after the children had been back in school for approximately 2 months. Wave 2 assessments were taken immediately after pupils returned to school after the second set of closures in March 2021, and these summer assessments approximately 3 months after they'd returned from these. The data from assessments were our primary outcomes, and I'm going to take you through some of those headlines today. But if you want to read the full findings, these can be found in the final report, which we published in December 2021, and these can be found on both the NFER and EEF websites. So for our attainment data, we used NFER standardised assessments for both of the Year 1 assessments and for autumn and spring of Year 2. We carried out diagnostic analysis in autumn and spring. Under normal circumstances, Year 2 would take a national end of key stage assessment in the summer, and we originally intended to collect this data for our 3rd assessment point. However, this was subsequently cancelled in 2021, so the last available past paper was reused for this summer measure, which was the 2019 paper. Schools were asked to administer the relevant assessments to all of their pupils in Year 1 and Year 2, and this involved pupils taking 2 reading papers and 2 mathematics papers in arithmetic and reasoning at each assessment point. The raw scores for each paper were converted into standardised scores to allow us to look at performance at each time point, but also across the academic year. Before we start looking at the actual findings, at this point I'd like to define the 2 gaps that we considered. We looked at 2 different measures for the assessments. The first we referred to as the COVID gap, and this looked at the difference between the pre-pandemic standardised sample and the children in our study. We also looked at the difference between pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds and their non-disadvantaged peers within our study. All of these had been affected by school closures, and this was known as the disadvantage gap. So I'm going to go on now to explain a little about the assessments, and please, if you're not statistically minded, please don't panic with this slide. I'm going to try and explain it to you in a quite straightforward way. So the NFER assessments follow the same format as the national curriculum tests and are purchased by schools to enable them to track the pupils' performance throughout the academic year. They were standardised pre-pandemic with a nationally representative sample, and this enabled us to compare the performance of the children in our study with that sample. So I just want to explain a few points which will hopefully help you understand the findings. So the raw scores are converted into standardised scores, and the average standardised score is set at 100 in the middle of our graph, with a standard deviation of 15. So based on a normal distribution, this would mean that approximately 2/3 of pupils will score between 85 and 115, which is the area shaded in purple. And almost all pupils would fall within the range 70 to 140. Scores outside of this would be considered exceptional and cannot be scored with the necessary reliability. Where we needed to use an exact score, for example, to calculate a mean, then a value of 69 or 141 is used. This proved to be important as we saw an increase in pupils who were awarded the score of 69. These are pupils who took the assessments but were not able to gain a sufficient number of marks to be able to gain the lowest possible standardised score of 70. This would typically be those pupils who scored around 5 marks or fewer across both of the papers in each subject. We calculated an effect size to tell us the size of any gaps, and as I mentioned earlier, this was an EEF study, and they have produced a toolkit which allows us to take the effect size and convert it into an estimated number of months of progress, which we've used to convert our findings into a measure that we feel is easily understandable. So this table shows you the standalone findings from the assessment data collection in autumn, spring and summer. As I said earlier, we're talking here about both the COVID gap and the disadvantage gap. And it's important that we refer to these as gaps rather than learning loss. As the children were out of school, it's not necessarily that anything has been lost, rather that it just may not have been learned yet. It's also important to note that all of these are standalone findings, and although the gaps have changed from one assessment point to another, these changes may not necessarily have been significant. We will look at this on the next slide when we look at the repeated measures analysis. So in autumn 2020, we carried out assessments with Year 2 only. When comparing the study cohort to the standardised sample, we found that there was a COVID gap of 2 months' progress in both reading and in mathematics. And we also noticed a large increase in the number of children in our study who were not able to engage effectively with the assessments and were therefore awarded the score of 69. That was true of both reading and maths. We also found a large gap in performance between the children in our study who are classed as being from disadvantaged backgrounds and their peers. Before the pandemic, there was already a disadvantage gap in each year group, and this was predicted to grow as a result of the pandemic. However, the disadvantage gap that we found of 7 months of progress was even larger than that predicted, despite both the disadvantaged and their non-disadvantaged peers having been affected by the school closures. One thing we did see in the autumn that was consistent was the performance of boys and girls. As with a standardised sample, girls performed slightly better in reading, while boys performed slightly better in mathematics. The Year 2s had their second assessment point in March 2021, and as we saw on the timeline earlier in the presentation, this took place as soon as schools reopened after the second set of closures. Here we found that the COVID gap for reading was now at 3 months of progress, and for mathematics was at 2 months. Again, we saw a large increase in the proportion of children who were unable to access the assessments in both reading and mathematics. We also saw a large disadvantage gap, with children from disadvantaged backgrounds being around 7 months of progress behind their peers in reading and 8 months behind in mathematics. The gender gap was again stable, with girls performing better than boys in reading and boys outperforming girls in mathematics. However, in maths, the gap did widen, suggesting that girls may have been more affected by the second set of school closures. In the summer, Year 2 sat a national curriculum paper in lieu of an NFER standardised assessment. This had to be treated slightly differently as it produced scale scores rather than standardised scores, which also meant that we were not able to include these results in our repeated measures analysis. You can see here that a gap in reading remains, although it does appear that children in this study actually perform better in mathematics. This is an encouraging sign, but does need to be carefully considered, as the impact of a new curriculum on our comparison sample may mean that we need to think about a possible sawtooth effect. Moving to Year 1, Year 1 took their first assessment in spring of 2021, and we saw some similarity in their results to the ones we had seen in Year 2. We found that in both reading and in mathematics, the COVID gap was at 3 months of progress, and we also saw a disadvantage gap of 7 months of progress in both subjects. Girls, again, doing better in reading, and boys in maths, as we had seen in the standardised sample. The summer results for Year 1 were more encouraging, with a COVID gap in maths now of just 1 month, although reading did remain at 3 months. The disadvantage gap, however, remained large at 7 months for reading and 6 months for mathematics. So having looked at each assessment as a standalone assessment, we then looked at the change in performance of Year 1 pupils between their spring and summer assessments and the Year 2 pupils between their autumn and spring assessments. And this table shows us the results. So for Year 2, when we tested for significance, the COVID gap actually widened between autumn and spring for both reading and mathematics. We need to remember that the disadvantage gap compares only children in our study. So when we're looking at the disadvantage gap, we are comparing any change to the disadvantage gap at the previous assessment point and not looking back to pre-pandemic times. So here in maths, you can see that the disadvantage gap widened for year 2 between autumn and spring, but stabilised for reading, where there was no significant change in the gap. In year 1, the findings are definitely more encouraging. The COVID gap for reading stabilised between spring and summer, and it actually reduced for maths, showing some positive signs of recovery. The disadvantage gap, when compared to the previous time point, reduced for both subjects as well. So, as interesting as these findings are, and despite all of this work and them being our primary outcomes, knowing that a gap in performance exists is only actually useful if we're then able to use our knowledge to help support teachers to close that gap. So we therefore also carried out diagnostic analysis in both autumn and spring to identify the strengths and weaknesses of the cohort across different domains.
Thank you, Sue. So as Sue mentioned, we ended up carrying out diagnostic information, which was taken from the NFER assessments. So this diagnostic assessment refers to identifying patterns in the way which children answer. So not just in terms of their underlying misconceptions and errors that they might be making, but also in terms of the strategies that they might be using. So this is done by not just marking their answers right or wrong, but actually categorizing the responses through coding, so giving certain types of answers all the same code. So normally in the NFER suite of assessments, we do this at a question level, but for this project, we wanted to make it more widely accessible and applicable, so we did this at assessment level. As we use the NFER assessments, which have been standardised, we had this data to compare back to from pre-pandemic, which helped us to identify areas where children may have been more affected or may have actually improved. So the data that we get out of the diagnostic assessment covers things like mean scores, so how many children got the question right, and also things like omission rate, so how many children missed out the question, which, as I mentioned, we could then compare back to the standardised sample. However, it is really important to note that this type of assessment is more formative and descriptive, so it's not tested for significance, and this means that we do have to interpret the results with a bit more caution. So all of this diagnostic assessment culminated in the production of a series of leaflets, which was provided for teachers and schools, intended to inform teaching and learning throughout the year. So one was published after the autumn findings and one after the spring findings as well. And I can show you an example of this now. So here, I'm not expecting you to read this, don't worry, but this just shows a brief overview of the leaflets. So these are available as downloads, and we can provide this link to the project page where all the documentation to do with this project is. Just to give you an idea, they comprised of an introduction page, which you can see on the left, subject headlines or overviews, which I'll take you through shortly, and then diagnostic findings for each subject with individual icons, which you can see as the third image. And then these findings were each broken down into the format of the final image on the right, which gives the evidence for each finding taken from the data and the implications for practice, just to put these suggestions into a bit more context. So this diagnostic assessment, as I mentioned, gave insight into the averages, showing relative areas of strength and areas of challenge as well. They're usually organised around skills in the curriculum, such as inference or retrieval for reading and numbering calculation for maths. So there were no diagnostics for the summer wave of data collection due to the volume of other measures at this time. So the table on screen shows the areas of strength and challenge for pupils in our study year. And you can see some patterns across year 1 and year 2 and between terms as well. But to give you a brief overview, so for the curriculum areas in reading and maths, the ones which children found difficult were broadly similar from the standardisation year to our study year. So that's the areas such as inference, which they found difficult in the standardised year. That was the same actually in our study year too. Unfortunately, disadvantaged pupils did find all areas of the curriculum more difficult than their non-disadvantaged peers. So that's what Sue was telling us is the comparison within the same year, not back to pre-pandemic. We also found that omission, so the amount of children missing the questions out, was higher in our study year too. As Sue talked about as well, we found that the gender gap was broadly stable, with girls slightly ahead in reading and boys slightly ahead in maths. However, the table just shows where that widened for Year 2 mathematics in spring. Another advantage of the diagnostics was that we could actually delineate down to particular errors, misconceptions, and, as I mentioned, strategies used, down to concepts such as place value errors in maths or difficulties with particular things such as inferring emotions in reading. All detail is in the report, which we did publish back in December, but I'll show you a more in-depth look at two of our findings, one from reading and one from maths. So these icons show the headlines which were taken from the Year 2 autumn and Year 2 spring reading diagnostics. So a pattern which we saw across the terms was in how difficult children found questions which required a written response. This was not surprising, given that the children in the standardised sample also found it difficult to provide a written response. As I mentioned, there was some similarities in those areas which they found difficult. However, what we did find was that in autumn, we saw that children found questions which require a longer written response, so perhaps a sentence rather than just a few words or a phrase. They found these types of longer written response questions harder than the standardised cohort, and they were also more likely to miss out these types of questions too. Although this is true for all groups, evidence did suggest that boys struggled comparatively more than girls with all written questions, and that was not just those longer written response questions, but also shorter ones as well, so whether just a couple of words or a phrase. So in spring, we found the same pattern across children's responses, that longer written responses were still proving harder for the 2021 cohort, the cohort in our study, with boys in particular struggling with these types of questions. Across autumn and into spring, we also found that children from disadvantaged backgrounds were more likely to give written responses which were not comprehensible. So we defined this as not enough legible letters, or the sentiment of the sentence may not have made sense. This suggests that these children may be at an earlier stage of writing in comparison to those children who struggled to give longer written responses, as they're not producing as much written sort of words that make a sense in a sentence. It would help if I could do the same. In spring 2021, boys were also more likely to give these types of answers in comparison to girls. So just to summarise this diagnostic area for you, our analysis suggests that children, particularly those from disadvantaged background and boys, may be struggling with written responses as a result of the school closures. And this could be due to many different underlying reasons. It could be issues with confidence, which may be why they're missing them out. Reading or handwriting fluency, letter formation, and even self-regulation of planning, monitoring, and actually writing the response. Teaching could look to identify underlying reasons for children's individual difficulties, possibly through further diagnostic assessment or small group work, and then tailor that support appropriately. So here we can look in more detail about a finding taken from the Mathematics Year 2 diagnostics. So fractions was an area which proved far more challenging for children in our study year than for the standardised sample, and this was detected through a large drop in performance, and they were also far more likely to miss out these questions than for any other topic area across the assessments. However, it's not all bad news. We did see progression from autumn to spring. So in autumn, children struggled with all aspects of fractions, including identifying fractions of a collection, shaded shapes, and they often confused halves and quarters. In one particular question, which asked for a fraction, the vast majority of children gave an integer instead, suggesting that they did not even have the foundational understanding about what constitutes a fraction. However, in spring, children have progressed and showed a good understanding of fractions as diagrams, even if the shaded sections were not adjacent to each other. However, when questions were posed without diagrams, only a very small proportion of children were able to answer correctly. Even here, though, we did see some progression as, despite not giving a correct fraction, a much larger proportion recognised that a fractional response was required. So with most of our findings, we always suggest that teachers may find it useful to carry out their own diagnostic assessment, as these findings were general and taken from the children obviously just involved in our study year. However, implications for teaching may point to the need to revisit or recap core teaching on the foundations of fractions before progressing to calculate with these. So hopefully that gives you an idea of the level of detail that we're able to drill down to in the diagnostic leaflets, and All the findings for years 1 and 2 and all terms are available to download from the link, which we'll provide to you at the end of the presentation. And I can now hand over to Lydia, who will take you through some of the contextual findings for the project.
Thanks, Tara. So alongside the attainment results, we also carried out some more contextual pieces of research. So these included measuring pupils' social skills and well-being. We carried out a survey with all of our head teachers, and also we interviewed a subsample of classroom teachers in the summer to provide this kind of extra context about what was going on surrounding the core assessments. I'm just going to talk you through some of the measures and some of the findings now. So to measure social skills and well-being, we used the CSBQ, which is the Child Self-Regulation and Behaviour Questionnaire. I'm going to refer to it as the CSBQ from now on. That was completed for a random sample of 12 children per class, and it was administered in autumn and then again at the end of the academic year in summer. The head teacher survey was administered in autumn term 2020. I am going to talk about the teacher interviews shortly, but just to say these two first. So in autumn, we administered the CSBQ, and this actually showed that the pupils in our sample were performing at or above expected levels in their social skills. Now, this was compared to norms that had been developed from an Australian sample of children, and it must be noted that this original sample contained children that were slightly younger than the children in this sample. We also think that teachers may have been rating their pupils with the view of considering there's a pandemic on, so maybe a bit more leniency in the judgments that teachers were giving. However, we obviously can't know that this was going on. That's just a flag that there are some reasons why we need to kind of use the CSBQ results with a little bit of caution here. However, at face value, the CSBQ results suggest that pupils were where we'd expect them to be in terms of social skills. So, as I said, also in autumn, we did a survey with head teachers, and we found that over 70% of the 140 head teachers who responded rated their year 1 and year 2 pupils as below last year's cohort in reading and maths ability, which obviously comes in line with our assessment results, really. The social skills of year 1 and year 2 overall were rated as below last year's cohort by around 50% of the head teachers, with actually around 40% rating them as the same as last year's cohort, and actually 8% rating them as above the last year's cohort. And finally, we asked them about the well-being of their year 1 and 2 pupils, and this was rated by around 50% as actually being the same as last year's cohort. Around 40% rated it below last year's cohort and 8% rated it as above. So you can see that it's quite a complex picture with regards to the social skills and well-being as a result of the school closures. And just to say, in the summer, we obviously administered the CSBQ again on the same pupils. We found that they had progressed with their social skills since autumn. And obviously, because they were already performing at or above expected levels in autumn, they were still performing at or above expected levels in summer and had indeed made some progress. So now I'm just going to talk about the teacher interviews, which we did with, as I said, a sample of 10 teachers in summer of 2021, so the end of the academic year. And this allowed us to ask about the first school closures and first return to school, but also the second school closures and subsequent return to school. So teachers were telling us that in the first school closures, they were focusing really on topics or work that had already been taught prior to the closures. So this quote here illustrates it quite nicely. So rather than teaching new material, we focused purely on things they had already learned. We were thinking this was probably the best situation for parents. We weren't sure at the time how much interactions parents were having. So really, essentially from the interviews, we got the context that, you know, schools were just trying to cover things that their pupils had already done, and they were quite unsure sometimes about what provision pupils had at home in terms of parental support, IT support, and so on. And then they were also telling us that in the first return to school in September of 2020, there was a real need to re-establish routines and appropriate school behaviours. So they were spending quite a lot of time on that. And they also were telling us that they were implementing a recovery curriculum during the first return. And then when we asked about the second school closures, which were in January of 2021, teachers told us that they felt much more prepared for the second closures. There was, as a result, more online and live teaching. So, you know, a lot of schools had secured grants or IT for some of their pupils to use, and just really have a little bit more time to get the systems in place. So that's what teachers were telling us with regard to the second school closures. And then finally, the second return to school, which was in March of 2021, in the spring, teachers were reporting that they were seeing reduced social skills in their pupils and increased levels of anxiety and sort of challenges around well-being. And as a result, we're implementing extra well-being support, talking time, and extra PSHE generally. And just to kind of sum up that, I think this quote says it quite nicely, which is that children have missed out on so much more than school. They have missed out on socialising, sports clubs, art and drama, and going on the stage. So at this point, teachers in our study were really telling us that they were just trying to kind of bring all that back for their pupils and, yeah, provide them with what they've missed over the very disrupted school year. So that's just a flavour of the context and the sort of opinions of some of the teachers in our study. So that was a kind of whistle-stop tour of this very big study that we carried out. In terms of next steps, you know, we know that recovery is a long-term process that takes, you know, more than just one academic year. So we're hoping to follow up with these children and follow the progress in their learning recovery throughout the next couple of academic years. So thank you everybody for listening to our presentation today. I think we've now got a little bit of time for questions.
Thank you very much, Lydia, and thank you very much for the presentation. Also, thank you to everybody who gave a portion of their day to listen to us. We hope you found the content of this webinar useful. Also, I have a few questions that have been sent over here, so I'll be putting some of these to our presenters now. So just the first question here. Regarding the low attainers who couldn't score 70, are these pupils who could not access the papers and were withdrawn from the assessment? Shouldn't they have been excluded from the analysis?
I'll take that one, I think. The NFER assessments are obviously the non-statutory assessments, but in our instructions to schools, we do follow the advice of STA in terms of disapplication and access arrangements. So we would ask, we did ask within the study that participating schools followed that same guidance within the study. And that guidance says that if a pupil is going to be withdrawn, then they would need to be unable to access the national curriculum. So by entering them for the assessments as part of the study, the assumption is that teachers feel that pupils are accessing at least some of the relevant curriculum, and on that basis we would not exclude the pupils who've attempted the assessments, even though they did end up getting quite low scores in some cases.
Thank you, Sue. Thanks for that. Another question here. Were there any places you saw relative improvements for reading and maths in the diagnostics?
Yeah, I can take that question. Hopefully you can hear me. So yes, absolutely. So as I said, the value in the diagnostics was the detail which it revealed to us, which may have otherwise been disguised by looking at the averages. So for year 2 reading, another curriculum area that we looked at alongside inference and retrieval was questions which assessed children's understanding of vocabulary. So we found that although children found these questions harder than retrieval questions, vocabulary questions showed the lowest drop in performance of all the curriculum areas, suggesting that it may have actually been less affected by the school closures. And if we go to the next set of data collection, we even had evidence which suggested a trend towards improved performance, particularly for girls across autumn and into spring. However, those questions, they do make up a smaller proportion of the assessment. So we just, again, have to interpret with caution as we usually suggest. And then for maths for year 2 and year 1, actually, there was a few areas where children performed as well or better than the standardised sample. So even though they performed lower overall, we did actually see those relative areas of strength. So for example, and all these details are in the published report, but children showed a good understanding of place value, number recognition, ordering numbers. Again, all of that was good or better than the standardised sample, which may suggest that those are all skills that weren't as affected, even though their performance was lower. Addition and subtraction were also particularly strong, with children performing as well or better than the standardised sample for year 1 and year 2 as well. So there was definitely areas of relative strength within that, which is a good news story that we like to share as well. So.
Thank you, Tara. Thank you. Just got another one here. What role does a school or teacher need to play in supporting social skills and well-being? Does this link to facilitating holistic recovery?
Yeah, so obviously supporting the development of children's social skills and their overall well-being is a key part of education. This was the case, obviously, even pre-pandemic. And it has also always been the case that for some children, school with, familiar routines and the opportunity to learn is a haven for some children. And obviously during the pandemic, particularly during the lockdowns, we know that some children will have had very, very challenging periods of isolation from friends and extended family, and a whole range of circumstances at home. So, but even if they've had minimal challenges with home learning, for all children, it's obviously not been a normal couple of years, and they're likely to have picked up on the anxieties of others. And as I mentioned in the main presentation, we have got some, obviously it's only from a small number of teachers, but we've got some anecdotal evidence that a wellbeing focus was necessary on returns to school. So I think it's just about, acknowledging that pupils need to be in the right headspace to be able to learn. And so the reports that we were seeing and that we've actually seen in other pieces of research that have come out around this time, basically extra wellbeing time, extra PSHE that teachers are already implementing with their pupils will really help the children to get into the right headspace to then work on their maths and reading recovery.
Thank you very much, Lydia. Unfortunately, that is all we've got time for today, as I'm conscious of time. But thank you again to everybody who joined today's webinar. I can see there are a few questions in the chat still. So what we'll be doing is we'll be sending all attendees a link to the recording of today's webinar, and we'll include links to any of the research discussed today within this email as well. You'll also have a chance to ask questions in response to this email. I will save these questions that have been asked today, but you will have an opportunity to ask questions in response to that email as well. Just a final point, please do make sure to follow NFER Classroom over on Twitter, where you can keep up to date with all of the latest information and any upcoming NFER Classroom webinars directly relevant to schools. So thanks again for joining, and we hope to see you soon.